Mason Blackwood, the feared mountain man, stood paralyzed as the small girl pointed to the cracked boulder and declared, "You're bigger than that rock." Her innocent words struck with devastating precision, bringing the hardened giant to his knees as tears carved paths down his face for the first time in 8 years. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go! Mason Blackwood was a man carved from the wilderness itself, 6'5", with shoulders broad as an oak trunk, hands calloused from years of felling trees and building homesteads across the untamed frontier. His beard, thick and flecked with silver, couldn't hide the scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, a permanent reminder of the bear that had tried and failed to end his life 3 winters past. Folk around Timber Creek called him the Mountain, not just for his imposing size, but for his unflinching resolve and the cold silence that surrounded him like morning mist. The township's children scattered when Mason's weathered boots thudded down the dirt roads. Mothers pulled their little ones close, whispering warnings. Even seasoned trappers and hunters gave him a wide berth at the trading post. Not out of disrespect, it was fear. Plain and simple. Fear mixed with reverent awe for a man who seemed more legend than flesh and blood. Today, Mason moved through the pine forest with practiced silence, despite his bulk. Summer sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, casting dappled light across the forest floor. He'd come to survey the eastern ridge. Rumors of silver had prospectors itching to clear-cut these woods. As the appointed forest warden, Mason intended to map the boundaries that must remain untouched. The solitude suited him. Out here, the trees didn't whisper about his past. The rocks didn't judge the blood on his hands. The wind didn't carry the echo of his wife Sarah's voice as she begged him not to go after the men who'd burned their first homestead. The forest simply existed alongside him, indifferent to the weight he carried. A flash of blue caught his eye, movement where there shouldn't be any. Mason froze, hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife at his hip. He waited, listening. There it was again, a soft humming, light footsteps crushing pine needles. Too delicate for a bear, too rhythmic for a deer. "Hello, Mr. Mountain Man." The voice, small and clear as a creek-polished stone, came from behind a massive pine. Mason remained silent, his jaw clenched. A moment later, a girl no more than 7 stepped into view. Her dress, once fine but now patched at the elbows, was indeed the blue he'd spotted. Chestnut hair fell in unruly waves around a face smudged with dirt but lit by eyes too knowing for her years. Mason recognized her immediately. Emma Hayes, daughter of the school teacher who'd arrived last autumn. Widowed, people said, though no one spoke of how. The woman kept to herself almost as much as Mason did, earning his unspoken respect. "You shouldn't be this far into the woods alone," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Emma tilted her head, unafraid. "I'm not alone now, am I? You're here." Single quotes. Despite himself, Mason's lips twitched. "Your mother know where you are?" "She's teaching the older children. Said I could explore but not cross the creek." She pointed eastward. "I haven't." Mason grunted, already turning to leave. "Head back anyway. These woods aren't for children. Are they for sad giants then?" He stopped mid-stride. "What did you say?" Emma stepped closer, fearless where men 3 times her size would hesitate. "Mother says you're sad, not scary. Carry something heavy no one can see." Mason's throat tightened. Sarah Blackwood had been gone 8 years now. He'd spent the first 3 hunting down the men who took her from him, and the last 5 ensuring no one got close enough to matter again. "Your mother talks too much." "She hardly talks at all," Emma countered, falling into step beside him, resumed walking. "Except about you. Says you helped us when our wagon broke before I was awake." "Says you refused payment," Mason remembered. The school teacher's wagon axle splintered beyond repair just outside town. He'd carried their belongings himself, rebuilt the wheel in silence before dawn, left before thanks could be offered. Didn't need payment. "Is that why you live all alone in that big cabin? Because you don't need anything?" Mason stopped again, looking down at the slip of a girl who asked questions men had been afraid to whisper. "You ask a lot of questions." Emma nodded solemnly. "Mother says curious minds build better worlds." Something long dormant shifted in Mason's chest. Sarah had said similar things once. Before the flames. "Your mother sounds wise." The words fell from his lips before he could catch them. Emma beamed. "She is. She taught me about rocks, too. Want to see?" Before Mason could refuse, the girl darted ahead to a massive boulder jutting from the forest floor. Nearly twice her height, it stood like a sentinel among the pines. "This one's granite," she announced, placing her small palm against its rough surface. "Mother says it was here before any people and it'll be here long after. Isn't that wonderful?" Mason approached slowly. "It's just a rock." Emma looked genuinely shocked. "It's not just a rock. It's older than anything alive. Older than the trees, older than the town. It's seen everything and changed so slowly we can't even notice." Her eyes lit with childhood wonder. "But you know what? Even this giant rock can be changed by tiny drops of water year after year. Mother says that's an important lesson." Mason stared at the boulder, then at the child. Something about her words punctured the armor he'd spent years forging around himself. "What lesson is that?" he asked quietly. "That big hard things can be changed by small soft things if given enough time." She looked up at him, her expression suddenly serious. Like people, Mason felt a tremor start in his hands. This child, this tiny fragment of humanity, speaking wisdom that pierced deeper than any knife. "Some things don't change, girl. Some things break instead. The words came out harsher than he intended. Emma didn't flint. Instead, she grabbed his massive hand with her tiny fingers, pulling him toward the boulder. Feel it, she insisted. It's got cracks, see? But it didn't break apart. The cracks just became part of it. Reluctantly, Mason placed his palm against the stone. It was cool despite the summer heat, solid yet pocked with countless small fissures and lines, evidence of centuries of weathering. You're bigger than that rock, Emma said suddenly, her voice filled with such conviction it startled him. And stronger, too. If it can stand here with all its cracks and still be beautiful, why can't you? Mason Blackwood, the man they called the Mountain, felt something inside him shift, a glacier that had begun to thaw. The weight he'd carried since finding Sarah's body in the ashes suddenly pressed down with unbearable force. His knees buckled, bringing him eye level with the child who saw too much. I'm not, he started, but couldn't finish. You are, Emma insisted, reaching out to touch his scarred cheek with gentle finger. Mother says broken things catch the light in more places. That's why they shine. A single tear escaped before Mason could stop it, then another. 8 years of carefully contained grief cracking like the spring ice on Timber Creek. He tried to turn away, to hide this weakness, but Emma's small hand remained on his cheek. It's okay, she whispered. The rock doesn't mind when it rains. Something between a laugh and a sob escaped him. Mason Blackwood, who had tracked killers across 3 territories without rest, who had survived a winter alone with a festering bear, who had built a reputation so fearsome grown men crossed the street to avoid his shadow, knelt, weeping before a child in an ancient boulder. Emma waited patiently, her presence an anchor as emotions Mason had buried beneath rage and solitude finally found release. When the storm began to subside, she simply took his massive hand in both of hers. Mother says tears are how the heart washes itself clean, she said matter-of-factly, like how the rain cleans the forest. Mason looked at her, this child who spoke with the wisdom of mountains. Your mother seems to say a lot of things. Emma smiled. Only important things. He rose slowly to his feet, suddenly aware of how small she was beside him, how fragile yet she had been the stronger one today. We should get you back, he said, his voice rough but gentler than before. Emma nodded but hesitated. Will you come meet Mother properly? She makes blackberry tea on Thursdays. Today's Thursday. Mason looked back at the boulder, standing ancient and cracked yet unbroken among the pines. Then down at Emma Hayes, who had somehow found the man beneath the mountain. I think, he said slowly, I might like that. As they walked back toward town, the forest seemed different somehow. The same trees, the same path, but Mason Blackwood moved through it, changed, still broken, still scarred, but beginning to catch the light in new places. The walk back to Timber Creek seemed both endless and too short. Mason found himself slowing his naturally long strides to match Emma's skipping pace. The child chattered about everything, the names she'd given to particular trees, the family of rabbits that lived near her schoolhouse, how she could identify birds by their songs alone. Mason mostly listened, offering occasional grunts of acknowledgement, but something had undeniably shifted. The wall he'd built around himself hadn't crumbled entirely, but Emma had somehow found a doorway. As they approached the edge of town, Mason felt the familiar weight of eyes upon him. Timber Creek's folk had grown accustomed to seeing him only when necessary for lumber deliveries, to report forest violations, or during the occasional town meeting where he stood silent at the back. Never had they seen Mason Blackwood walking alongside a child, especially one who held his hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Folks are staring, he muttered, instinctively pulling his hand away. Emma looked up at him, then around at the townspeople who quickly averted their gazes. They're just surprised. Mother says people fear what they don't understand. Your mother's right about that, Mason said, wondering again about the woman who raised such an unusual child. The schoolhouse stood at the eastern edge of town, a modest wooden structure with a small attached living room. As they approached, Mason felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. Not quite fear, but a cousin's of it. Nervousness. It had been years since he'd engaged in anything resembling a social call. Before they reached the door, it swung open. Catherine Hayes stood in the threshold, worry etched across her features until she spotted them. Relief washed over her face, quickly replaced by curiosity at the sight of her daughter's companion. Emma, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I thought we agreed you'd stay within sight of the schoolhouse. I was exploring, Mother, and I found Mr. Blackwood, Emma announced triumphantly, as if she discovered buried treasure instead of the town's most feared recluse. Catherine Hayes was not what Mason had expected. In his limited observations, he'd noted she was slight of frame, with the same chestnut hair as her daughter, always neatly pinned back. But facing her now, he was struck by her eyes, clear and direct, meeting his without a trace of the fear or awe he'd grown accustomed to seeing in others. Mr. Blackwood, she acknowledged with a small nod. I see my daughter has imposed upon your solitude. She wasn't an imposition, Mason said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. When was the last time he'd reassured anyone of anything? Emma tugged at her mother's skirt. I invited him for blackberry tea. It's Thursday. A flicker of surprise crossed Catherine's face, but she recovered quickly. Indeed it is. She hesitated, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. You're welcome to join us, Mr. Blackwood, though I understand if you have other obligations. It was an easy out, offered without judgment. Mason could decline, returned to his solitary cabin in the comfortable silence of his own company. The wise choice, surely. I have time, he heard himself say. The Hayes quarters were modest, but warm. Bookshelves lined every available wall space, stuffed not just with the expected educational texts, but also volumes of poetry, natural philosophy, and what appeared to be journals bound in mismatched leather. Dried flowers hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with subtle fragrance. A small writing desk sat beneath the window, papers neatly stacked, an inkwell catching the afternoon light. "Please sit," Catherine gestured to one of 3 chairs at the small table. Mason lowered himself carefully, acutely aware of how his bulk seemed to shrink the already tiny room. Emma busied herself fetching cups and saucers while her mother stoked the small stove where a kettle already simmered. "Emma tells me you've been teaching her about geology," Mason said, seeking safer ground than the emotions the child had unearthed in the forest. Catherine smiled, the expression softening her otherwise serious countenance. "Among other things, she has a natural curiosity about the world. She said something about rocks being changed by water drops. That small things can change big things given time." Something flickered in Catherine's eyes, surprise. Perhaps that her daughter's lessons had made such an impression on this man of few words. "Water is persistent," she said, bringing the steaming kettle to the table. "It doesn't fight the stone directly, it simply continues being itself, day after day, year after year, until the seemingly immovable has been transformed." Mason watched as she poured the deep purple tea into 3 mismatched cups. Her hands were delicate, but marked with the calluses of someone unafraid of labor. A teacher's hands, yes, but not only that. "Like tears," Emma chimed in, climbing onto her chair. "Remember Mr. Blackwood? Like rain cleaning the forest?" Catherine's eyebrow raised slightly at this, but she asked no questions, for which Mason was grateful. Instead, she passed him a cup that seemed absurdly small in his weathered hands. "The blackberries grow wild along the northern ridge," she explained. "Emma and I gather them each summer." The tea was tart and sweet, unexpectedly comforting. "It's good," Mason offered, the compliment awkward but sincere. They drank in silence for a moment before Emma launched into a detailed account of their forest encounter, thankfully omitting the part where the fearsome mountain man had wept against ancient granite. Instead, she focused on the rock itself, her description making it sound like a sentinel watching over the forest rather than a mere geological formation. "And Murrah Blackwood knows all about the forest, Mother. He could teach me even more than the books." "Emma," Catherine gently chided, "Mr. Blackwood has his duties as forest warden. We shouldn't presume on his time." Mason cleared his throat. "I wouldn't mind," he said, surprising himself again. "Showing her things about the forest, that is, if you permitted it." Catherine studied him, her gaze neither judgmental nor fearful, simply evaluating. Mason had the distinct impression he was being measured against some internal standard known only to her. "That's very kind," she said finally. "Perhaps you could join us on our Sunday walks sometimes. We often collect specimens for Emma's natural history collection." It was a careful compromise. Her daughter would learn from his expertise, but under maternal supervision. Mason respected the boundary. "I could do that." Emma beamed triumphantly, as if she'd orchestrated this entire outcome from the moment she'd spotted him in the forest. As the conversation continued, Mason found himself speaking more than he had in years. Catherine asked intelligent questions about the forest ecosystem, the season's effects on wildlife, the proper way to identify which trees could be safely harvested. Her knowledge was already substantial. She clearly studied her surroundings with a scholar's eye, but she listened to his experience with genuine interest. When he finally rose to leave, the sun was already dipping toward the western ridge. Emma threw her arms around his waist in an unexpected embrace that left him frozen, hands awkwardly suspended in air before gently, briefly touching her shoulders. At the door, Catherine offered her hand. "Thank you for bringing her home safely, Mr. Blackwood." Her handshake was firm, her palm warm from the teacup. "Mason," he corrected quietly. "Just Mason is fine." Something in her expression softened. "Catherine," she returned. "And thank you for the tea. Catherine." Walking back toward his cabin in the fading light. Mason felt odd, as if his body didn't quite fit him anymore. The forest around him was unchanged, the same trees, the same path he'd walked hundreds of times, but something within him had shifted, like sediment disturbed after years of stillness. At home, he built his evening fire mechanically, mind replaying fragments of conversation, the child's laughter, the mother's thoughtful gaze. He'd spoken more words today than in the past month combined. His throat felt strange from the use. As darkness settled in the cabin filled with familiar shadows, Mason's eyes fell on Sarah's wooden hairbrush, the one possession of hers he'd kept, displayed on the rough-hewn mantel. For 8 years, looking at it had been like pressing on a bruise of pain he returned to, ensuring the hurt remained fresh, a reminder of why walls were necessary. Tonight, for the first time, he picked it up and simply remembered her smile instead of her absence. He ran his thumb over the worn bristles and thought of water drops on stone, of tiny, persistent forces creating change where none seemed possible. "Small, soft things," he murmured to the empty cabin. Given enough time, that night, Mason Blackwood slept without nightmares for the first time in 8 years, his dreams instead filled with granite boulders, purple tea, and a child's simple wisdom that had somehow reached places inside him he'd thought long since turned to stone. Sunday arrived with golden light and birdsong. Mason woke before dawn, as was his habit, but found himself unusually attentive. He trimmed his beard, not too short, but neater than it had been in years. He selected his least worn shirt, one Sarah had made him that still held its deep blue color despite countless washings. Such vanity seemed foolish for a simple walk in woods he traversed daily. yet he couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation in his chest. By mid-morning, he stood at the edge of town, hat in hand, watching as Emma spotted him from the schoolhouse steps and broke into a run. "You came?" she called, her delight unrestrained. "Said I would," Mason replied simply, though the child's enthusiasm warmed something long cold within. Catherine followed at a more measured pace, carrying a woven basket. She wore a simple dress of forest green, her hair loosely braided rather than severely pinned as it was during school days. The sight of her, relaxed and smiling in the Sunday light, caught Mason off guard. "Good morning, Mason," she greeted him. "We're glad you could join us." "Ma'am," he nodded, then corrected himself. "Catherine." Emma took his hand without hesitation. "I want to show you my favorite creek. It has the smoothest stones for skipping." The three set out toward the eastern forest, Emma chattering between them like a bridge connecting two quiet shores. Mason noticed Catherine carried a small leather-bound journal and pencil along with her gathering basket. "You document your findings?" he asked as Emma ran ahead to examine a patch of wildflowers. Catherine nodded. "I've been keeping records of local flora since we arrived. The botanical diversity here is remarkable compared to where we lived before." "And where was that?" A shadow passed briefly across her face. "Boston, originally. Then Chicago." Mason sensed the unmapped territory of her past places where caution was advised. He recognized the signs because he guarded similar borders around his own history. Quite a change coming to Timber Creek. "Yes," she agreed, watching Emma collect flowers ahead of them. "But necessary. And ultimately good for us both, I think." They reached the creek by midday. The water ran clear over smooth stones, dappled sunlight dancing across the surface. Emma immediately set to work showing Mason her stone skipping technique, which resulted in more splashes than skips. He demonstrated his own method, sending a flat stone bouncing 5 times across the water's surface. "Again," Emma demanded, delighted. As Mason searched for the perfect skipping stone, he caught sight of Catherine seated on a fallen log, sketching in her journal. She was focused intently, occasionally glancing up at the surrounding vegetation before returning to her work. Curiosity drew him closer. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the open journal. She hesitated only briefly before offering it to him. The page displayed a detailed drawing of a wild orchid, each petal rendered with careful precision, alongside notes about its location and characteristics. "You have skill," he said, genuinely impressed. "I studied botanical illustration before." She paused. Before Emma, Mason handed back the journal, recognizing another boundary. "These woods have plants some folks don't notice. I could show you if you're interested." Catherine's eyes bright. "I would appreciate that very much." They spent the afternoon exploring the creek bank, Mason pointing out medicinal herbs and rare flowering plants he'd discovered in his solitary patrol. Catherine documented each finding, while Emma collected specimens for her own nature box, her pockets soon bulging with interesting pebbles and feathers, as shadows lengthened across the forest floor. Mason led them to a small clearing he'd discovered years ago, a perfect circle of grass surrounded by ancient pines, where wild strawberries grew in abundance. "Fairy ring," Emma exclaimed, dropping to her knees to examine the tiny red berries nestled among the leaves. "That's what Sarah called it too," Mason said quietly, the words escaping before he could contain them. Catherine looked up from where she knelt beside Emma. "Sarah?" The name hung in the air between them. Mason hadn't spoken it aloud to another person in years. "My wife," he said finally. "She passed 8 years ago." Catherine's expression held no pity, only a gentle understanding that suggested familiar pain. "I'm sorry, Dot," single quotes Emma, sensing the shift in mood, approached Mason with a handful of strawberries. "For you," she said, offering them with soil-stained fingers. Mason accepted them carefully as if they were precious gems rather than woodland fruit. "Thank you, Emma." They ate strawberries in comfortable silence as the forest around them prepared for evening. Birds called their day's end songs, and a distant owl began its early hunting calls. "We should head back before dark," Catherine said eventually, rising and brushing soil from her skirt. The walk back was quieter, all three content with the day's simple pleasures. As they neared town, however, the peaceful mood shattered at the sight of 3 men waiting at the forest edge. Mason recognized them immediately. Timber company men who'd been pressing to expand operations into the protected eastern ridge. "Mr. Blackwood," called the leader, a sharp-featured man named Porter. "Fancy finding you in such ... Domestic company." Mason instinctively stepped forward, placing himself between the men and Catherine and Emma. "Porter, you're a long way from the lumber camp." Porter smiled without warmth. "Just concluding some business in town. We've been looking for you, actually. Company has a new proposal for the Eastern Ridge. Very generous terms. The Eastern Ridge is protected. You know that. Protected by what? A piece of paper? Times change, Blackwood. Town needs progress. Jobs. Can't keep living in the past." Porter's gaze slid to Catherine and Emma. "Though I see perhaps you're finally moving forward yourself." Mason felt heat rise in his chest. "You've had my answer. It hasn't changed." Porter's expression hardened. "I'd reconsider if I were you. Company's patient, but not infinitely so. Shame if anything happened to these lovely woods you're so fond of." He tipped his hat with mock politeness toward Catherine. "Ma'am, miss. Evening to you both." The 3 men departed toward town, leaving a chill in their wake despite the warm evening air. "Who were those men?" Emma asked, her earlier exuberance dim. "Just business," Mason said, his voice deliberately light for her benefit. "Nothing to worry about. Catherine's gaze, however, was sharp with understanding. As Emma skipped ahead toward home, she touched Mason's arm briefly. Is there trouble? Mason considered deflecting. He would have days ago. But something had shifted between them, a fragile trust worth honoring with truth. The timber company wants land they can't have, land that should stay wild. He looked toward the forest they'd just left, and they've been pushing harder lately. Making threats against you, against the forest? Same thing, far as I'm concerned. Catherine studied him. Because of Sarah? The question startled him. Most people in town knew not to mention his wife, yet Catherine had intuited the connection without being told. Partly, he acknowledged. We built our first home on the eastern ridge. After the fire, after I lost her, I made sure that land was protected. No logging, no mining. Some things should remain untouched. Catherine nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding beyond sympathy. Some wounds need wilderness to heal. They had reached the schoolhouse. Emma waited at the steps, her arms full of the day's treasures. As Mason prepared to take his leave, Catherine spoke again. We're having stew tomorrow evening. Nothing fancy, but there's always enough for three. The invitation hung between them, simple yet monumental. Mason looked at Emma, then back at Catherine, seeing not pity but genuine connection in her eyes. I'll bring bread, he said. I bake it myself. Catherine's smile was small but genuine. Until tomorrow, then. As Mason walked back to his solitary cabin, Porter's veiled threats echoed in his mind, but they seemed somehow less potent than before. The forest around him, the forest he'd sworn to protect, no longer felt like just a refuge or a reminder of loss. Today it had been something else. A place of discovery, of sharing, of cautious joy. In his pocket he carried a smooth creek stone. Emma had insisted he keep. It has a perfect white line around it, she'd explained, like it was broken once and then made stronger where it healed. Mason turned the stone in his fingers as he walked, feeling its cool, smooth surface. The white quartz line caught the last of the evening light, gleaming like a promise against the gathering dark. Dawn found Mason at his stone hearth, kneading dough with methodical precision. His massive hands, capable of felling trees and breaking bones, worked the soft mass with surprising gentleness. Baking had been Sarah's domain once she'd taught him during their first winter together, laughing at his clumsy attempts, but after her death, the ritual had become his own form of remembrance. Each loaf a silent conversation with her memory. Today's bread was special. He'd added wild honey and dried cranberries harvested last autumn, ingredients he normally saved for holidays or significant occasions. The realization that dinner at the Hayes schoolhouse qualified as such gave him pause, his hands stilling in the dough. What was he doing? Playing at normalcy with a schoolteacher and her daughter wouldn't erase the blood on his hands or restore what he'd lost. The town still whispered about the three men who'd never returned after Sarah's death. No evidence tied Mason to their disappearances, but everyone knew, everyone remembered. Yet as the morning sun streamed through his cabin window, illuminating motes of flower dust in the air, Mason continued kneading. Whatever this new feeling was, this tentative connection to Catherine and Emma, he couldn't bring himself to sever it, not yet. By midday, the bread had cooled enough to wrap in clean cloth. Mason changed into his Sunday shirt again and set out toward town, hyper-aware of the glances that followed his passage. Timber Creek had grown accustomed to seeing him only for necessities or official forest business. 2 social calls in as many days was unprecedented. As he passed the general store, a voice called out, halting his stride, "Blackwood, a moment of your time." Mayor Hargrove stood in the doorway, his substantial girth blocking most of the entrance. A politician to his core, Hargrove maintained cordial relationships with everyone in town, even its most notorious recluse. Mayor Mason acknowledged with a nod. Hargrove stepped closer, lowering his voice despite the empty street. "I've had Porter and his men in my office all morning. They're pushing hard for those eastern timber rights." Mason's jaw tight. "Forest charter's clear. That land is protected. Charters can be amended," Hargrove said carefully, "especially when the company is offering to build a new sawmill. Jobs, Blackwood, progress. At what cost? That's what I'm trying to determine." The mayor studied him. "This isn't just about trees, is it? It's about Sarah." Mason's expression hardened. "Don't." Hargrove raised his hands in placation. "I respected your wife, Black, one of the finest women to grace this town, but it's been 8 years. The living need work, need futures. Find another solution. Porter isn't a man who takes no for an answer. There are rumors he's bringing in surveyors regardless of permits." Hargrove hesitated. "And I've noticed you've been spending time with our schoolteacher and her girl." Mason's hands clenched involuntarily around the wrapped bread. "What of it? Just ... Be careful. Small towns have long memories. Catherine Hayes has her own past following her." Hargrove stepped back toward the store. "Think about what I said about the timber rights. Sometimes compromise prevents greater losses." Mason continued toward the schoolhouse, the mayor's words settling like stones in his stomach. The implication that Catherine had secrets didn't surprise him. He'd sensed as much, but Hargrove's warning carried the distinct scent of threat, however veiled. Emma spotted him through the window and threw open the door before he could knock. "You brought bread?" she exclaimed, eyeing the cloth-wrapped package. "Mother, Mason's here with bread." Catherine appeared behind her daughter, wiping her hands on a small towel. Unlike yesterday, her hair was pinned up again, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. Right on time, she smiled, gesturing him inside. The stew's just finished. The schoolhouse kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic, reminding Mason of comforts long forgotten. He placed the bread on the table, suddenly self-conscious. "It's nothing fancy. Catherine unwrapped the loaf, her expression warming at the sight of the cranberries dotting the golden crust. Beautiful, Mason, truly. Emma climbed onto a chair to peer at it. Did you bake this yourself? Father never baked, said it was women's work. Emma, Catherine chided gently. It's all right, Mason said, meeting the child's curious gaze. My wife taught me. After she died, I kept at it. Felt like ... keeping part of her alive somehow. The words emerged easier than he'd expected, sitting in the warm kitchen with its herb-scented air. Catherine's eyes held no judgment, only quiet understanding as she sliced the bread. The meal passed with surprising ease. Emma dominated the conversation, recounting school lessons and posing questions about forest creatures. Mason found himself explaining the hibernation patterns of bears, the secret language of crows, and why certain trees grew crooked toward the light. As the meal concluded and Emma excused herself to organize her nature collection, Catherine poured 2 cups of coffee and finally asked the question Mason had been anticipating. Mayor Hargrove spoke to you today. It wasn't a question. Mason nodded, cupping the warm mug in his palms. About the timber company, she continued. And possibly about me. Single quotes. Mason studied her across the small table. He suggested you have secrets. A rueful smile touched her lips. In a town this size, having any past at all qualifies as suspicious. I don't need to know, Mason said quickly. Perhaps not. Catherine set down her cup, but I'd prefer honesty between us, whatever this is becoming. She rose and moved to the small writing desk, extracting a folded newspaper clipping from a drawer. When she returned, she placed it before him without comment. The headline read, Prominent Chicago physician found dead. Wife sought for questioning. Below was a grainy photograph of a younger Catherine beside a distinguished-looking man in formal attire. The article was dated 6 years prior. Mason looked up, finding Catherine's gaze steady despite the tension in her shoulders. He was respected, wealthy, and utterly merciless behind closed doors, she said quietly. For years, I believed I deserved it. The bruises, the broken bones, set in secret, the constant terror. What kind of educated woman allows such treatment? That's what society would ask. Mason's hands tightened around his cup. What happened? He fell down the stairs after drinking heavily. A tragic accident, according to the official determination made weeks later. Her voice remained measured, controlled, but by then, Emma and I had disappeared. New names, new lives. Emma's father was a monster who never laid a hand on her. Thank God. But she saw more than a child should. Catherine reclaimed the clipping, refolding it precisely. I didn't kill him, Mason, but I won't pretend I mourned him either. Mason absorbed her words, understanding now why she'd settled in this remote town, why she recognized the weight he carried without being told. They were both fugitives from different forms of violence. His enacted, hers endured. Hargrove knows, he found out last year. Has held it over me since, though never directly. Small reminders that my position here depends on his goodwill. She met his gaze directly. Now you know . Single quotes. Mason reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. Some secrets deserve to be kept. The relief in her eyes was palpable. And yours, Mason? The men who never returned after Sarah died? The question should have angered him, should have sent him retreating behind his walls. Instead, sitting in this warm kitchen with bread he'd baked being shared by people who somehow mattered, he found himself answering. 3 men set fire to our home while Sarah was inside. They wanted the land for lumber access. His voice was low, matter of fact. I tracked them north for 2 weeks. What happened in those woods stays in those woods. Catherine turned her hand beneath his, their palms meeting. And that's why you protect the forest now. Why you won't let the timber company take the eastern ridge. It's all I have left of her. Of us. Emma's voice interrupted the moment, her small form appearing in the doorway. Mother, I can't find my special rock from yesterday. Catherine withdrew her hand from Mason's, the connection broken but not forgotten. Check your coat pocket, love. That's where you put it. As Emma disappeared again, Catherine turned back to Mason. Porter won't stop pushing. Men like him never do, I know. What will you do? Mason considered the question, feeling the weight of his past decisions alongside this new, fragile connection forming in his life. What I must, but differently this time. The evening drew to a close with Mason helping wash the dishes, his large hands dwarfing the plates as Emma supervised with exaggerated seriousness. When he finally took his leave, Catherine walked him to the door. Thank you for the bread, she said, and for your honesty. Thank you for the same. They stood for a moment in the doorway, neither quite ready to end the evening. Finally, Mason spoke. I patrol the eastern ridge tomorrow. There's a place there, a meadow high up where the first spring flowers always bloom. If you and Emma would like to see it, Single quotes. He trailed off, the invitation hanging incomplete. Catherine's smile reached her eyes. What time shall we be ready? As Mason walked home through the gathering darkness, the town seemed different somehow, as a place of painful memories, and more a landscape containing possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. Behind him, in the schoolhouse window, a lamp remained lit long after he disappeared from view. Morning mist clung to the forest floor as Mason waited at the trailhead. The eastern ridge path was steep and rarely traveled. Most townsfolk had neither reason nor inclination to venture so deep into the wilderness. For Mason, each step of the familiar trail carried memories. Sarah laughing as she balanced on fallen log. The afternoon they'd spotted twin fawns nestled in ferns. The day they'd chosen the high meadow spot for their cabin, standing hand in hand as they imagined a future now lost to ash. He hadn't brought anyone here since the fire. The ridge had become his private sanctuary, a place where grief could breathe without witnesses. Yet today he found himself scanning the path for Catherine and Emma's approach with something akin to anticipation. They appeared through the morning haze right on time, Emma skipping ahead while Catherine followed at a measured pace. The child wore sturdy boots and carried a small satchel that Mason suspected contained her ever-growing nature collection. Catherine had dressed practically in a divided skirt and sturdy jacket, her hair braided and coiled against her neck. "We're ready for adventure," Emma announced, reaching Mason's side with boundless energy. Mason nodded, finding himself momentarily without words. The significance of this journey, of sharing this particular place, settled heavily upon him. Catherine seemed to sense his hesitation. "We can visit another day if today isn't good," she offered quietly. "No," Mason said, finding his voice. "Today is right. The wildflowers won't wait." The trail began gently enough, winding through familiar woodland before climbing steadily upward. Mason automatically shortened his stride to accommodate Emma's pace, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife signs. The child absorbed everything with wide-eyed wonder, collecting fallen feathers and interesting pebbles along the way. Catherine walked beside him in comfortable silence, her presence steady and undemanding. Halfway up the ridge, they paused at a natural spring burbling from between moss-covered stones. "Best water in the territory," Mason said, kneeling to fill his canteen. Emma cupped her hands beneath the flow, drinking eagerly. "It tastes like the earth is singing," she declared, water dripping down her chin. Catherine laughed, a sound Mason realized he'd heard too rarely, and accepted the canteen when he offered it. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a brief contact that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through his chest. "How much farther?" Emma asked, already scanning the upward path. "Not far now. See that rock formation up ahead? Looks like a bear sitting down." Mason pointed to an unusual outcropping. Just beyond that, as they continued climbing, the forest began to thin, ancient pines giving way to younger growth, finally opening to the sky. When they crested the final rise, Mason paused, allowing Catherine and Emma to step past him. The meadow spread before them like a hidden kingdom. Spring had transformed the high clearing into a tapestry of wildflowers, purple lupin, golden poppies, and delicate white yarrow swayed in the gentle breeze. Beyond the meadow, the vista opened to reveal rolling forests stretching to distant mountains. The world spread out like a map beneath the endless sky. "Oh," Catherine breathed, her composure momentarily displaced by wonder. Emma had already darted forward, arms outstretched as if to embrace the entire meadow. "It's magic," she called back, dropping to her knees among the flowers. Mason remained at the edge, watching their reactions. Catherine turned to him, her eyes bright with appreciation. "Thank you for sharing this," she said softly. He nodded, unable to articulate how much her understanding meant. Instead, he gestured toward a flat-topped boulder at the meadow's far edge. "Over there," he said. "That's where our cabin stood." Understanding dawned in Catherine's expression. "This is where you and Sarah lived for 3 years. Happiest of my life." They walked together toward the stone foundation, all that remained of the cabin he'd built with his own hand. Wildflowers had reclaimed the ruins, growing between charred stones that still bore faint scorch marks despite years of weather. Emma had found a patch of particularly vibrant bluebells and was carefully gathering a small bouquet. Mason watched her for a moment before turning back to the ruins. "We chose this spot because of the view," he said, his voice low enough that only Catherine could hear. "Sarah said she wanted to wake up every morning feeling like she could see forever." Catherine stood beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his. "It's beautiful, Mason. I understand why you protect it so fiercely. After the fire, I couldn't bear to rebuild. Felt like betraying her memory somehow." He gestured vaguely toward the distant town. "Built the new cabin far enough away that I couldn't see this place every day, but close enough that I could still watch over it. And the men who did this?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Timber scouts. They wanted a road through here, fastest route to virgin forest beyond the ridge. Sarah refused to sell. I was away when they came back." Catherine's hand found his, her fingers cool against his skin. "I'm sorry. Been alone since," he said simply. "Seems safer that way, for everyone." Before Catherine could respond, Emma approached. Her carefully assembled bouquet extended toward Mason. "These are for Sarah," she said, her young face solemn with understanding beyond her years. "Mother says people we love become part of beautiful things after they're gone, like flowers and trees and butterflies." Mason knelt to accept the bouquet, his massive frame sinking to the child's level. "That's a fine thought, Emma. Thank you." With gentle reverence, he placed the flowers on the cornerstone of the old foundation. The three stood in silence for a moment, the breeze rustling through the meadow like a whispered acknowledgement. The peaceful moment shattered at the crack of a breaking branch. Mason turned sharply, instinctively moving in front of Catherine and Emma. 3 men emerged from the tree-lined Porter, flanked by 2 rough-looking companions Mason didn't recognize. "Well now," Porter called, his voice carrying across the meadow. "What a touching scene. The beast of Timber Creek, tamed at last." Mason's hand moved to the knife at his belt. "You're trespassing, Porter. This land is protected." Porter spread his hands in mock innocence. "Just taking measurements. The company needs accurate surveys." His gaze shifted to Catherine and Emma. "Didn't expect to find you playing family man. Blackwood, times really do change." Catherine stepped forward, positioning herself beside Mason rather than behind him. "Mr. Porter, I believe Mr. Blackwood has made the legal status of this land clear." Porter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, with all due respect, You might want to consider who you're associating with. Blackwood here has quite a history. Not the sort of man a respectable woman, particularly one with a questionable past herself, should be seen with. Mason took a step toward Porter, his hands clenching into fists. Say what you came to say to me and leave them out of it. Fair enough. Porter gestured toward his companion. Company sent these fellows to help me explain the situation. The Eastern Ridge logging will proceed with or without local approval. Progress waits for no man, not even the famous mountain man. You have no permits. Paperwork's being processed in the capital as we speak. Governor's a company investor, didn't you know? Porter's expression hardened. This is courtesy, Blackwood. Step aside or things might get messy. Again, the threat hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable. Mason felt the familiar heat of rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to hunt down Sarah's killers. His vision narrowed, focusing on Porter's smug face, the distance between them, the moves it would take to Mason. Catherine's voice cut through the haze, her hand gentle but firm on his arm. When he turned, he found her eyes steady on his, neither afraid nor judgmental, simply present. Emma stood beside her mother, her small face solemn as she watched the confrontation. The sight of them, these two people who had somehow become important to him, cooled the burning in his vein. Not here, Catherine said quietly. Not like this. Single quotes. Mason drew a deep breath, straightening to his full imposing height. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but carried the unmistakable weight of promise. You walk away now, Porter. Today, and we'll settle this properly through the law. Porter seemed momentarily taken aback by Mason's restraint. He'd clearly expected, perhaps even hoped for violence that would justify whatever he had planned next. The law's already decided, Blackwood. You just don't know it yet. Porter adjusted his hat, signaling his men to retreat. Enjoy your flowers while they last. The three men disappeared back into the forest, leaving a palpable tension in their wake. Mason remained rigid until the sound of their footsteps faded completely. Are you all right? Catherine asked, still beside him. Mason looked down at her hand on his arm, then to Emma, who watched him with wide, trusting eyes. Then finally to Sarah's cabin foundation with its freshly placed bluebells. Years ago, I would have torn him apart, he admitted quietly. Didn't even think twice after Sarah died. Just hunted them down. Catherine nodded, understanding without condoning or condemning. And now, Mason looked across the meadow at the beauty Sarah had loved, at the new companions who had somehow found their way past his defenses. Now there's more at stake than vengeance. Emma approached, slipping her small hand into his large one. Mother says bad men are just scared of good things they don't understand. Mason felt something shift inside him, like a river changing course after years of flowing one way. He squeezed Emma's hand gently. Your mother is a wise woman, little one. As they prepared to descend the ridge, Mason took one last look at the meadow, at Sarah's flowers dancing in the breeze. For the first time in 8 years, saying goodbye didn't feel like betrayal. Word of the confrontation on the Eastern Ridge spread through Timber Creek like wildfire. By the following morning, the town had divided into factions, those who supported the timber company's promises of prosperity and jobs, and those who stood with Mason's protection of the ancient forest. The divide cut through families and longtime friendships, turning the once peaceful community into a simmering pot of tension. Mason noticed the shift immediately when he entered the general store 3 days after the meadow, and conversations halted mid-sentence, and gazes either hardened or averted entirely as he collected his monthly supplies. The storekeeper, Davis, who'd known Mason for over a decade, kept his eyes fixed on the ledger as he tallied the purchases. Here you had some trouble up on the ridge, Davis finally said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Mason placed a sack of flour on the counter. No trouble, just trespassers. Porter's been talking all over town. Says you threatened his surveyors. Davis glanced up briefly. Says you had the school teacher with you, and her girl. Mason met his gaze steadily. Porter was trespassing on protected land. He knows it. I know it. The law knows it. Maybe so. Davis pushed Mason's purchases across the counter. But the company's offering good wages, Black. People here need that. Can't feed children with trees and memories. The words hit their mark, but Mason's expression remained impassive as he gathered his supplies. At the door, he paused. Tell Porter if he steps foot on that ridge again without proper authorization, be as polite next time. Outside, Mason loaded his wagon, aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. 8 years he'd lived alongside these people. Never close. Never truly one of them, but respected for his fairness and skill. Now he felt the community's trust fracturing around him. As he prepared to leave town, a familiar voice called his name. Catherine stood outside the schoolhouse, gesturing him over. Inside, he could see the children engaged in their lessons, Emma's dark head bent studiously over a slate. I heard what happened at the store, Catherine said as he approached, her voice low. Mason raised an eyebrow. News travels fast. Small towns have few entertainments besides gossip. Her expression grew serious. Porter visited the school board yesterday, suggested I might not be a suitable influence on Timber Creek's children, given my ... association. Mason's hands tightened on his wagon reins. He threatened your position. Not directly, but the implication was clear. Catherine smoothed her skirts, a gesture Mason had come to recognize as a sign of her gathering resolve. I'm not afraid of Porter, Mason, but I am concerned about Emma. I've put you both at risk, Mason said, the realization settling heavily upon him. I never intended that. Catherine's eyes flashed. You didn't put us at risk. Porter and his greed did that, and I won't be intimidated by him or anyone else. Not again. The fierce determination in her voice reminded Mason of Sarah, not in manner or tone, but in the core of unshakable strength beneath the composed exterior. It stirred something in him that had long been dormant. What can I do? He asked simply. Catherine looked back at the schoolhouse. The town meeting tonight. Everyone will be there to discuss the timber company's proposal. People respect you, Mason, whether they show it or not. They need to hear the truth from you, not Porter's version. Mason had avoided town meetings for years, finding little purpose in communal debates that rarely affected his solitary existence. The thought of standing before the entire township, of making his private convictions public, sat uneasily upon his shoulders. I'm not one for speeches. Then don't make a speech, Catherine said. Speak the truth about the forest, about what's at stake. She hesitated, then added softly, I'll be there. Emma too. Something in her voice, a note of confidence in him that he scarcely felt himself, made refusal impossible. Mason nodded once. I'll be there. That evening the town hall overflowed with residents. Mason arrived to find every bench filled, with additional townsfolk standing along the walls. Mayor Hargrove presided from a small podium, with Porter and 2 company representatives seated prominently nearby. As Mason entered, a ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Catherine and Emma sat near the back. The child waved enthusiastically when she spotted him, earning disapproving looks from neighboring families. Mason nodded in acknowledgement before taking his position against the far wall, arms crossed over his chest. Mayor Hargrove called the meeting to order, his practiced politician's voice filling the hall. Citizens of Timber Creek, we've gathered tonight to discuss the Westland Timber Company's proposal for developing the Eastern Forest Tract. Mr. Porter has assured me this represents a significant opportunity for our community's growth and prosperity. Porter stood, spreading maps across the front table with theatrical flourish. Friends and neighbors, he began, his salesman's smile gleaming in the lamplight. What I offer tonight is nothing short of Timber Creek's future. The Eastern Ridge has some of the finest old-growth timber in the territory, timber that's currently sitting unused while families here struggle to make ends meet. He gestured expansively at his maps. The company proposes a new road through the protected sector, leading to a state-of-the-art sawmill that will employ at least 30 men at competitive wages. Timber Creek could become a regional hub of industry rather than a forgotten backwater. Murmurs of approval rippled through sections of the crowd. Porter's eyes found Mason in the shadows. Some would keep this town trapped in the past, preserving trees at the expense of progress. But I ask you, what feeds your children? What builds their future? Sentiment or prosperity? More nods, more whispers of agreement. Porter continued, outlining profits and opportunities with the practiced ease of a man who'd sold many communities on sacrificing their natural resources for short-term gain. When he finally concluded, Mayor Hargrove cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Porter. Now, as this proposal would require amending the forest charter that currently protects the Eastern Ridge, we should hear from our forest warden. He turned, gesturing toward the wall. Mr. Blackwood, would you share your perspective? The room fell silent as Mason stepped forward. He'd never been a man of many words, and standing before the entire town, feeling their collective gaze, nearly stopped him in his tracks. Then his eyes found Emma and Catherine in the crowd. The child gave him an encouraging thumbs up while Catherine nodded slightly, her faith in him evident even from across the room. Mason took a deep breath and began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. Most of you have known me for 8 years. I've never asked anything of this town except to respect the forest charter that protects our wilderness. He paused, gathering thoughts that felt too big for word. That charter exists for a reason. Old-growth forests don't come back once they're gone. Not in our lifetime. Not in our children's lifetime. He moved toward Porter's maps, pointing to the ridgeline. This isn't just trees. It's an entire living system. The eastern watershed feeds 3 counties downstream. Clear-cutting would destroy that watershed, causing flooding in spring and drought in summer. Expressions shifted among the crowd as this reality sank in. Mason continued, his voice gaining strength. The company promises 30 jobs now. But what happens when they've taken every tree worth cutting? Those jobs disappear, but the damage remains. He looked directly at Davis, the storekeeper. You can't feed children with memories, that's true. But you can't drink money when the wells run dry either. Porter stepped forward, interjecting smoothly. Westland Timber employs sustainable practices. I've seen your sustainable practices firsthand, Mason interrupted, rare anger coloring his tone. 8 years ago, when your company's men burned my home with my wife inside because we wouldn't sell our claim on that ridge, a shocked silence fell over the room. Though rumors had circulated for years about Sarah's death, Mason had never spoken publicly about the circumstance. Porter's face drained of color. That's a serious accusation, Blackwood. One you can't prove. 3 men came to our cabin, Mason continued steadily. They offered money first, then threats. When Sarah refused to sell, they returned while I was away. His voice remained even despite the pain evident in his eyes. The sheriff called it an accident. I knew better. He turned to address the assembled townsfolk directly. This isn't just about my wife's memory. It's about something larger than all of us. That forest was here before any of us, and with proper care, it'll be here long after. Some things can't be replaced once destroyed. From the back of the room, Emma's voice suddenly piped up, clear and innocent, like the big boulder in the forest. It's been there forever, but it still has cracks. Mr. Mason is bigger and stronger than that rock. He has cracks too, but that makes him catch more light. A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the crowd at the child's unexpected contribution, but Mason saw the wisdom in her words, the same wisdom that had begun his own healing. Catherine placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, but her proud smile was unmistakable. Mayor Hargrove cleared his throat, reclaiming control of the meeting. Yes, well, thank you, Miss Hayes. And thank you, Mr. Blackwood, for your passionate perspective. Now, citizens, the council will need time to consider, if I may. Catherine stood, her composed presence drawing all eyes. As Timber Creek's school teacher, I believe I should speak to what we're teaching our children through this decision. Mayor Hargrove hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Catherine surveyed the room with the same calm authority she employed with her students. We tell our children that actions have consequences, that integrity matters, that some principles are worth standing firm upon. Her gaze moved across familiar faces. If we sacrifice our natural heritage for temporary gain, what lesson does that impart to them? She gestured toward Mason. Mr. Blackwood has suffered personal tragedy to protect land that belongs to all of us and to future generations. His stand isn't merely about memory, it's about foresight. As Catherine retook her seat, the mood in the town hall had noticeably shifted. Porter launched into rebuttals, but his arguments seemed to find less purchase than before. When Mayor Hargrove finally called for a preliminary vote of sentiment, the community divided almost evenly, with Porter's supporters holding only a narrow margin. The council will deliberate further, Hargrove announced, clearly disappointed by the lack of consensus. No action will be taken regarding the forest charter until a final decision is reached. The meeting dispersed. Mason found himself surrounded by townsfolk, some offering support, others arguing points from his speech. He'd spoken more words publicly tonight than in the past 8 years combined, and the effort had left him drained but strangely unburdened. When he finally extracted himself from the crowd, he found Catherine and Emma waiting outside beneath the starlit sky. You did well, Catherine said simply. Mason shook his head. We only bought time. Porter won't stop. No, she agreed, but neither will we. Emma slipped her hand into his. I told everyone you were bigger than the rock, she said proudly. Looking down at her upturned face, Mason felt something crack and mend simultaneously within his chest. You did, little one, and I'm starting to believe it might be true. The week following the town meeting brought an uneasy quiet to Timber Creek. Porter and his men had departed for the territorial capital, presumably to press their case with higher authorities. The temporary reprieve should have been a relief, but Mason felt the tension building like storm pressure before a tempest. His years tracking men through wilderness had taught him to recognize when danger gathered just beyond sight. Despite his concerns, life took on a new pattern that Mason found himself unexpectedly cherishing. Mornings were spent patrolling the forest, afternoons often found him at the schoolhouse after lessons ended, and evenings frequently included supper with Catherine and Emma. The townsfolk had largely adjusted to the sight of the formidable mountain man walking alongside the school teacher and her daughter. The whispers still followed them. On this particular afternoon, Mason sat on the schoolhouse steps, whittling a small wooden figure while waiting for Catherine to finish with her students. He'd taken to carving animals for Emmy bears, deer, foxes, each one more detailed than the last as his large fingers remembered skills long unused. Today's creation was an owl, its feathers emerging with each careful stroke of his knife. The school door opened and children streamed out in their usual exuberant fashion. Most gave Mason a wide berth, though a few of the braver ones offered shy greetings, which he acknowledged with solemn nods. Emma was always last to exit, helping Catherine clean the classroom before leaving. When she finally appeared, her face lacked its usual brightness. She sat beside Mason on the step, her small shoulders slumped. What troubles you, little one? He asked, setting aside his carving. Emma picked at a loose thread on her dress. Billy Tanner said you're dangerous. Said his pa told him you killed men up north and that's why you live alone. Mason's hands stilled. He'd known this moment would come eventually, when Emma would hear the whispers, the fragments of truth mixed with fear and speculation that had shadowed him for years. Does that frighten you? He asked quietly. Emma looked up at him, her young face serious. No, but I didn't know what to say back to him. Mason considered his words carefully. This child deserved truth, but measured to her understanding. After my Sarah died, he began slowly. I was filled with a terrible anger. I did things then that I can't undo. He met her gaze directly. Some men do bad things and never feel sorry. Others do bad things and spend the rest of their lives trying to be better. I'm trying to be better, Emma. She nodded solemnly. Like the rock with the crack that gets stronger where it healed, something like that. Mason agreed, marveling again at her ability to simplify complex emotions to their essence. Emma leaned against his arm. I told Billy that everyone's dangerous when they're hurt bad enough, but that doesn't mean they stay that way. A lump formed in Mason's throat. Before he could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway, her expression strained. Emma, please go inside and gather your thing. I need to speak with Mason. Something in her voice alerted Mason immediately. He stood as Emma obediently went inside. What's happened? Catherine descended the steps, stopping close beside him. A letter arrived from the school board. They've called an emergency meeting tomorrow to review my position. Mayor Hargrove delivered it personally. Mason's jaw tightened. Porter's work. Almost certainly. The mayor hinted that concerns have been raised about my personal associations affecting my professional judgment. Her voice remained steady, but Mason detected the underlying fear. They're threatening my livelihood, Mason. Without this position, Emma and I have nowhere to go. The old rage stirred in Mason's chest, the familiar heat that had once driven him to hunt men through northern forests. He tamped it down, focusing instead on the practical danger facing Catherine and Emma. You could stay at my cabin, he offered without thinking. It's remote enough, and confirm every rumor Porter has spread about us. Catherine shook her head. Besides, running and hiding didn't solve my problems in Chicago. I won't teach Emma that pattern again. Mason admired her resolve even as he worried for her safety. What will you do? Catherine squared her shoulders. Attend the meeting. Present my unblemished teaching record. Remind them that my personal life has no bearing on my ability to educate their children. She paused. And hope that reasonable minds prevail. And if they don't? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was softer. Then we'll face that when it comes. Emma emerged from the schoolhouse, seemingly unaware of the adult's tension as she clutched her latest nature drawings. Mason handed her the nearly completed wooden owl, which she accepted with delight. His eyes look like he knows important secrets, she observed, tracing the carved feathers with her finger. Owls usually do, Mason replied, forcing lightness into his tone. As they walked Catherine and Emma home, Mason remained unusually quiet, his mind churning through options and contingencies. The indirect attack on Catherine was calculated and effective. Porter had identified his most vulnerable point and struck precisely. It's not his land, not his forest, but the two people who had somehow become essential to him. That evening, after sharing a subdued meal, Mason took his leave earlier than usual. Catherine walked into the door while Emma organized her growing collection of wooden animals on the small bookshelf. You're planning something? Catherine said, her voice low enough that Emma couldn't hear. Mason didn't deny it. Porter won't stop at the school board. You know that. Whatever you're thinking, Mason, don't. Her hand caught his arm. Violence won't solve this. It never does. I wasn't always the man you see now, Catherine. Her eyes held his steadily. I know exactly who you are, Mason Black. Both the man you were and the man you're becoming. Her voice softened. The question is whether you know. Before he could respond, she reached up and placed her palm against his bearded cheek, their first truly intimate gesture. The simple touch anchored him, drawing him back from the precipice of old habits and darker impulse. Promise me you won't confront Porter alone, she whispered. He covered her hand with his own. I promise. The oath felt binding in a way no promise had since Sarah. As Mason walked home through the darkening forest, he wrestled with conflicting instincts, the drive to protect through force warring with his growing desire to become someone worthy of the trust Catherine and Emma had placed in him. Dawn found him already awake, splitting wood behind his cabin with methodical precision. The physical exertion helped clear his mind, each swing of the axe releasing tension that had built through a restless night. He was so absorbed in the rhythm that he almost missed the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon him. Mayor Hargrove dismounted awkwardly from a lathered horse, his usual dignified appearance disheveled from hard riding. His expression bore genuine alarm. Blackwood, he called, striding forward. Porter's men, they've moved onto the eastern ridge. At least 20 workers with equipment. They started clearing trees at first light. Mason lowered his axe slowly, processing this information. They have no legal right. They claim to have emergency authorization from the territorial governor due to urgent infrastructure needs. Hargrove mopped his brow with a handkerchief. It's questionable at best, likely fraudulent, but by the time proper authorities intervene, the trees will be gone, Mason finished. Why are you telling me this, Mayor? You've made your support for the timber company clear enough. Hargrove had the grace to look uncomfortable. I favor progress, yes, but not lawlessness, not destruction without proper process. He hesitated, and there's more. Porter was in town last night, drinking heavily at the saloon. He made threats. Mason's hand tightened on the axe handle. What kind of threats? Against you primarily, but he also mentioned the schoolteacher. Said she'd learn what happens to women who choose the wrong side. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. I may disagree with your stance on the forest, Blackwood, but I won't stand by while a man threatens a woman under my town's protection, especially not one who teaches our children. Mason was already moving, gathering his rifle and ammunition from inside the cabin. The school board meeting canceled, Hargrove confirmed. I've seen to that. But Porter's men are already cutting. If you mean to stop them, you'll need help. Mason paused, studying the mayor with new consideration. Why would you help me now? Hargrove straightened his vest with dignity. Because while I believe in progress, I believe in law more. Porter crosses lines no decent man should. By the time Mason had saddled his horse, Hargrove had outlined what he knew of the timber crew's position on the ridge. As Mason prepared to ride, the mayor asked, What's your plan, Blackwood? You can't fight 20 men alone. Mason checked his rifle one final time. I'm not fighting anyone if I can help it. I made a promise. To who? Someone who believes I'm better than my past. He mounted his horse. Ride to the schoolhouse. Tell Catherine what's happening. Tell her I'm keeping my word. Without waiting for a response, Mason urged his horse toward the eastern trail. The familiar path to the ridge seemed different now, no longer just a road to memory and grief, but a path to a future he was only beginning to envision, a future worth protecting through means other than violence. As he rode, Mason's thoughts returned to Emma's bold, solid yet cracked, strong yet changed by time and elements. The child's simple observation had started something in him, a transformation as gradual yet inevitable as water-shaping stone. The hardened shell he'd built around himself after Sarah's death had begun to crack, allowing light to enter places long dark. He reached the edge of the protected forest just as the sun crested the eastern mountains. In the distance, he could already hear the rhythmic thud of axes and the occasional crash of falling timber. The sound struck him like physical blows. Destruction begun while the town still deliberated, while the law remained unresolved. Mason dismounted, securing his horse to a sturdy pine. Then, rifle in hand but pointed safely downward, he began walking toward the sounds of destruction. Not as a vengeful ghost from the past, but as a man with a promise to keep to Catherine, to Emma, and increasingly to himself. The destruction was worse than Mason had anticipated. By the time he crested the final rise overlooking the meadow, at least a dozen massive pines lay felled. Their centuries of growth ended in moments. A crude road had already been carved through the underbrush wide enough for wagons to haul the timber away. The air smelled of sawdust and crushed vegetation instead of wildflowers and pine. Mason stood unnoticed for several minutes, taking stock of the situation. 20 men worked with practiced efficiency professional lumberjacks, not local hires. They wielded axes and two-man saws, their movements coordinated and swift. Several armed guards patrolled the perimeter, rifles resting casually against their shoulders. At the center of the operation stood Porter, examining maps spread across a makeshift table. He looked pleased with himself, periodically pointing to areas where men should focus their efforts next. Mason's finger rested lightly against his rifle's trigger guard. From his position, he could easily pick off Porter before anyone realized what had happened. 8 years ago, fresh from Sarah's death, he wouldn't have hesitated. The old rage urged him toward this simple solution: eliminate the threat, protect what was his. Instead, he lowered his rifle and continued his approach openly, making no attempt to conceal his presence. One of the guards spotted him and shouted a warning. Within moments, every axe stopped mid-swing and all eyes turned toward the approaching figure. Porter straightened, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. A smile spread across his face as he recognized the newcomer. Blackwood, come to witness progress firsthand? He called, his voice carrying across the devastated clearing. Or perhaps you've reconsidered our offer. Mason stopped at the edge of the clearing, close enough to be heard without shouting but maintaining a cautious distance from the armed men who now formed a loose semicircle around Porter. You have no legal right to be cutting here, Mason stated, his deep voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. This land is protected by territorial charter. Porter gestured expansively at the felled trees around them. I have authorization from the territorial governor himself. Emergency infrastructure needs. All perfectly official. He patted the breast pocket of his coat. Would you like to see the paperwork? We both know it's worthless, Mason replied evenly. Forged or bought with bribes. Either way, it won't stand up to proper scrutiny. Porter's smile tightened. Perhaps, but scrutiny takes time, Blackwood. How many trees will be left by then? He stepped forward, lowering his voice, though his men could still hear. You're alone. As usual, the mighty mountain man against the inevitable march of progress. It's almost tragic. Mason scanned the clearing, noticing with a pang that they'd already begun cutting near the ruins of his and Sarah's cabin. The foundation stones had been pushed aside to make way for their road. The wildflowers Emma had so carefully placed trampled underfoot. The familiar heat of rage rose in his chest, but with it came Emma's voice in his memory. You're bigger than that rock. And Catherine's touch on his face as he promised not to confront Porter alone. He'd given his word, a commitment that now weighed more than vengeance. I'm asking you one time to stop cutting and leave this land, Mason said, his voice controlled despite the emotions churning beneath. The proper authorities will determine what happens here, not men with axes and fraudulent papers. Porter laughed, turning to his men as if sharing a joke. You hear that, boys? The forest hermit is asking us to leave. His expression hardened as he turned back to Mason. This isn't a negotiation. Blackwood, the timber is coming down. Today. Tomorrow. Until we've cleared what we need. He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. I know what you did to those men after your wife died. You think the company doesn't investigate its enemies? You got away with it then because no one cared about 3 missing timber scouts. But times have changed. He gestured to his armed men. Try anything now and you'll hang as the murderer you are. Mason remained impassive. Though Porter's words confirmed what he'd long suspected, the company had always known about their men's fate. They simply hadn't valued them enough to pursue justice. And what about your latest threats? Mason asked quietly. Against the school teacher? Something ugly flashed in Porter's eyes. Ah, yes, the lovely widow Hayes, or should I say the lovely fugitive Catherine Miller. That's her real name, isn't it? The woman who fled Chicago after her husband's suspicious death. Mason's hands clenched involuntarily, but he kept his voice steady. Leave her out of this. I'm afraid it's too late for that. Porter's smile returned, crueler now. A telegram has already been sent to Chicago authorities informing them of Mrs. Miller's whereabouts. A woman suspected of murder teaching innocent children. The school board will have no choice but to dismiss her immediately. The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. Catherine and Emma's carefully constructed new life threatened with a single telegram. He took a half step forward before catching himself, aware of the guards raising their rifles in response. Porter noticed the reaction with satisfaction. You've grown soft, Blackwood. Found yourself a ready-made family, have you? The murderer, the fugitive, and the bastard child. How touchingly domestic. Mason's vision narrowed, blood pounding in his ears. One more word against Emma, and promise or no promise he would. The sound of approaching horses broke the tension. Mason turned to see a group of riders cresting the same ridge he'd climbed earlier. His heart sank when he recognized Catherine at the forefront, followed by Mayor Hargrove, and most surprisingly, at least 15 townsfolk, shopkeepers, farmers, and several members of the town council. Emma rode with her mother, her small face set in determined lines that mirrored Catherine's own expression. They reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, taking in the devastation with visible shock. What is this? Porter demanded, striding forward. Mayor, I thought we had an understanding. Hargrove dismounted with as much dignity as his bulk allowed. That was before I understood your methods, Porter. Threatening women, destroying protected land, forging government documents. These aren't the actions of legitimate business. Catherine's gaze found Mason's across the clearing, relief evident in her expression at finding him unharmed and alone, keeping his promise. Despite the provocation he'd clearly faced, Porter's face darkened. This land will be logged one way or another. The company has invested too much to turn back now. Actually, came a new voice as another rider emerged from the tree line. That's not accurate. The newcomer wore the distinctive uniform of a territorial marshal, the silver star on his chest catching the morning light. Behind him rode two deputies, their expressions professionally neutral, but their hands resting near their sidearms. Marshal Turner, Hargrove greeted with obvious relief. Thank you for responding so quickly to my telegraph. The marshal dismounted, approaching with the measured confidence of legal authority. Mayor Hargrove's message raised serious concerns about fraudulent permits and illegal logging operations. I see those concerns were well-founded. Porter produced a document from his pocket. I have authorization right here, signed by Governor Williams himself. Marshal Turner barely glanced at the offered paper. Governor Williams is currently in Washington, has been for 3 weeks. Whoever signed that wasn't him. He turned to his deputies. Secure these men and their equipment. No one leaves until we sort this out. As the deputies moved to carry out their orders, Porter's composure finally cracked. This is outrageous. The company will have all of you ruined for this interference. The company, Marshal Turner replied calm, will likely be facing significant legal penalties once this investigation concludes. Fraud, trespassing, destruction of protected resources, and he glanced toward Mason. Threats against private citizens. While the marshal's men began documenting the destruction, Catherine and Emma made their way to Mason's side. Emma immediately wrapped her arms around his waist in a fierce hug that caught him by surprise. You didn't fight them, she said, her voice muffled against his coat. Even when they were being bad men. Mason rested his hand gently on her head. I made a promise, little one. Catherine's eyes met his, filled with understanding and something deeper that made his heart quicken when Hargrove told us what was happening. I knew we couldn't let you face this alone. You shouldn't have come, Mason said quietly. Porter knows about Chicago. He sent telegram. Catherine paled slightly but squared her shoulders. Then we'll face that too when it comes. Together. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. Together, not alone, as he had been for 8 years, not running, as she had been for 6. Mayor Hargrove approached, clearing his throat awkwardly. Blackwood, I owe you an apology. I allowed my vision of progress to cloud my judgment about Porter and his methods. He gestured to the townsfolk who had accompanied them. Many of us did. Mason recognized several faces from the town meeting men who had supported the timber company's proposal now stood witness to its deception. What changed your minds? He asked. Davis, the storekeeper, stepped forward. Threats against a woman and child cross a line no decent community can tolerate, and he glanced uncomfortably at the devastation around them. Seeing this destruction firsthand makes the cost clearer than any speech could. As the marshal organized the removal of Porter and his men, Mason walked with Catherine and Emma to what remained of his former home site. The stone foundation had been partially destroyed. The wildflowers crushed, but the setting sun still bathed the meadow in golden light that promised renewal. Emma knelt to gather what unharmed flowers she could find. We'll plant new ones, she declared with certainty. The forest knows how to heal itself. Mother taught me that. Mason looked from Emma to Catherine, then across the damaged but still beautiful ridge that had defined his existence for so long, first as a home shared with Sarah, then as a sanctuary for his grief, and now as something else, something new. Yes, he agreed softly. I believe it does. 3 days after Porter's arrest, the reckoning Catherine had long feared finally arrived. The Chicago authorities had responded to Porter's telegram with alarming efficiency, dispatching a detective to investigate the whereabouts of Catherine Miller, widow of the prominent doctor, James Miller, whose death had officially been ruled an accident despite lingering suspicions. The detective, A lean, sharp-eyed man named Holloway arrived on the afternoon stage, his presence sending ripples of speculation through Timber Creek. He checked into the town's only hotel before immediately calling upon Mayor Hargrove to announce his purpose and authority. Mason learned of Holloway's arrival while delivering firewood to the schoolhouse. Catherine received the news with outward calm, though Mason noticed her hands trembled slightly as she arranged kindling in the stove. "I always knew this day might come," she said quietly, once Emma was occupied with her lessons in the adjoining room. "Part of me has been waiting for it since we arrived here." "What will you tell him?" Mason asked, setting down the last log beside the stove. Catherine straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. "The truth, as much of it as he needs to hear." She met his gaze directly. "I didn't kill James, but I didn't mourn him either, and I won't apologize for that." Mason nodded, understanding completely the complex morality of survival. "Do you want me there when he comes?" A sad smile touched her lips. "That would only confirm the rumors Porter spread about us." "I don't care about rumors." "I know." She reached out, briefly touching his hand. "But this is something I need to face on my own, for Emma's sake if nothing else. I can't teach her to run from difficult truths." Before Mason could respond, a sharp knock at the schoolhouse door announced that their time for private conversation had ended. Mayor Hargrove stood on the steps, his expression grim, with Detective Holloway at his side. The detective's keen eyes took in the scene, Mason's proximity to Catherine, the domestic familiarity between them with professional assessment. "Mrs. Hayes," Hargrove began formally, "this is Detective Holloway from Chicago. He has, questions regarding your previous residence." Catherine drew herself up with quiet dignity. "Of course. Please come in, Detective." "Mayor," she turned to Mason, "thank you for the firewood. Mr. Blackwood, that will be all for today." Mason recognized the dismissal for what it was, Catherine's attempt to shield him from involvement in her troubles, but as he stepped onto the porch, he paused long enough to meet Detective Holloway's calculating gaze. "Mrs. Hayes is well respected in this community," Mason said, his deep voice carrying the unmistakable weight of both truth and warning. "Whatever questions you have, I trust you'll conduct your inquiry with appropriate respect." Holloway studied him with professional curiosity. "And you are…" Mason Blackwood, Forest Warden. Something like recognition flickered in the detective's eyes. "Blackwood, the name's familiar from my briefing. You were involved in the timber company incident?" "I was." The two men measured each other in silence before Holloway nodded slightly. "I'll conduct my investigation professionally, Mr. Blackwood. Justice requires nothing less done." School quotes of Mason held his gaze a moment longer before departing, aware that his presence had likely confirmed whatever connections Holloway was already piecing together between Catherine's situation and his own. He spent the remainder of the day patrolling the damaged eastern ridge, his mind divided between the forest wounds and Catherine's uncertain fate. By evening, word had spread throughout Timber Creek that the Chicago detective had spent hours questioning Catherine at the schoolhouse before expanding his inquiry to various towns. Rumors flew like autumn leaves that arrest was imminent, that Catherine would be extradited to Chicago, that Emma would be placed in an orphanage. Mason was splitting wood behind his cabin, working off his frustration through physical exertion, when he heard approaching hoofbeats. To his surprise, it was Emma who appeared around the bend in the trail, riding one of the schoolhouse's gentle mares. Her face was tear-streaked but determined as she dismounted with practiced ease. Emma. Mason set aside his axe, alarmed. "Does your mother know you're here?" The girl shook her head, her lower lip trembling. "She's still talking to that man." Made her cry, Mason. Her small hands clenched into fists. "He said he might have to take her back to Chicago." "Can't do that, he can't." Mason knelt before her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Your mother is strong, Emma. Stronger than most. And whatever happens, she won't leave you. But what if they make her?" Tears spilled freely now. "What if they take her away like they took my father away?" The pain in her voice struck Mason deeply. Despite Catherine's careful protection, Emma clearly understood more about their precarious situation than her mother realized. "Listen to me," Mason said, his voice gentle but firm. "No one is taking your mother anywhere. Not while I'm here," Emma sniffled. "Promise?" The word hung between a child's request for certainty in an uncertain world. Mason had made many promises in his life, some kept, some broken. This one, he knew instantly, he would defend with everything he had. "I promise," he said solemnly. "Now let's get you home before your mother worries herself sick." He helped Emma back onto her mare before mounting his own horse. They rode together through the darkening forest, the child's fears gradually easing as Mason pointed out owl nests and deer trails along the way. By the time they reached the schoolhouse, Emma's tears had dried, though her determination remained undiminished. Catherine stood on the porch, her face pale with worry as they approached. When she spotted Emma, relief flooded her features, quickly followed by stern disapproval. "Emma Hayes, do you have any idea how terrified I've been? Riding out alone at dusk, without a word?" Emma slid from her horse, suddenly contrite. "I'm sorry, Mother. I needed to tell Mason about the detective." Catherine's gaze shifted to Mason, who had dismounted more slowly. In the lamplight spilling from the schoolhouse windows, he could see the strain of the day etched on her face. "She was safe with me," he said simply, "though it had brought her straight back had I'd known she left without permission." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "Thank you for bringing her home." She turned to her daughter. "Inside now, Emma. It's past your bedtime, and we have much to discuss about appropriate behavior." As Emma reluctantly trudged inside, Catherine remained on the porch with Mason. For a long moment neither spoke, the weight of unasked questions hanging between them. Finally, Mason broke the silence. How bad is it? Catherine sighed, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. Detective Holloway is thorough. He's interviewed half the town already. It seems certain townsfolk were quite willing to share their observations about our friendship. To hell with them, Mason said quietly. A small smile touched her lips. Precisely what I thought, though I expressed it more delicately. She hesitated. He knows about the men who disappeared after Sarah died. Porter apparently shared that particular piece of local folklore before being transported to the territorial jail. Mason's jaw tightened. Did he ask you about it? Not directly, but I suspect he's building a composite picture, the reclusive widower with a violent past, the fugitive schoolteacher with a suspicious one. Two damaged people finding common ground. She looked up at him. He's not entirely wrong. No, Mason, but he doesn't have the full truth either. Catherine stepped closer. And what is the full truth, Mason? The question hung between them, weighted with all that had remained unspoken through their growing connection. Mason found himself at a crossroads, retreat into the safety of old barriers, or step forward into vulnerability he had avoided for 8 years. The truth, he said slowly, is that I've been half alive since Sarah died, existing, not living, until a little girl told me I was bigger than a boulder, and her mother looked at me and saw a man, not a mountain of grief and rage. Catherine's eyes shimmered in the lamplight. And what does that man want now? Mason reached for her hand, engulfing it in his larger one. A chance to be whole again. With you. With Emma. He paused, gathering courage for words long unspoken. I love you both. Whatever comes with Holloway, with Chicago, with the past, we face it together. Catherine's free hand rose to touch his face, fingers gentle against his beard. I told Holloway the complete truth today. About James, about Chicago, about my flight with Emma, and about you. Her voice strengthened. I told him that in Timber Creek I found not just sanctuary but redemption. That a man everyone feared showed me and my daughter nothing but gentleness and protection. What did he say to that? He said evidence and testimony would determine his course, not sentiment. Her fingers traced Mason's jaw. But he's a better man than I initially judged, more interested in truth than mere closure. Mason closed his eyes briefly, leaning into her touch. Whatever happens, you won't face it alone. Not anymore. No. Catherine agreed softly. Not anymore. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, the meeting of two people who had survived separate storms and now stood on shared ground. Then it deepened, becoming a promise more binding than words could express. When they finally parted, Catherine smiled. We should go. Emma will be watching from the window. And Holloway's given the town quite enough to gossip about already. Mason nodded, reluctantly stepping back. Will you tell me when Holloway reaches his decision? You'll be the first to know. She paused, then added with quiet certainty. Whatever happens next, Mason, know that you've already saved us in all the ways that matter most. As Mason rode home through the starlit forest, the weight he had carried for 8 years felt somehow lighter. Not gone, perhaps it never would be entirely, but transformed into something he could bear, without being crushed beneath. Like the boulder in the forest, cracked but standing, catching light where once there had been only solid darkness. 3 weeks passed with Detective Holloway's presence casting a long shadow over Timber Creek. The town held its collective breath as he conducted his investigation with methodical precision, interviewing townsfolk, corresponding with Chicago authorities, and spending long hours in private conversation with Catherine. Throughout this ordeal, Mason maintained a careful distance in public while providing unwavering support in private, bringing supplies to the schoolhouse and spending evenings with Catherine and Emma after the detective retired to his hotel room. The timber company conflict had faded to secondary importance in the wake of these more personal stakes. Porter remained in territorial custody awaiting trial for fraud and trespassing, while the damaged eastern ridge stood partially scarred but protected once more. Mayor Hargrove had formally reaffirmed the forest charter with unanimous council support, ensuring no future attempts could circumvent proper legal channels. But all of these victories meant little if Catherine faced extradition to Chicago. On this particular morning, Mason worked in the small garden behind his cabin, preparing the soil for spring planting. The rhythmic work of turning earth grounded him, offering a semblance of control when so much remained beyond his influence. He had just straightened to wipe sweat from his brow when he spotted a solitary rider approaching through the trees. Detective Holloway dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to long journeys. He removed his hat, revealing hair grayed at the temples despite his relatively young age. Mr. Blackwood, he greeted with professional courtesy. Mason nodded in acknowledgement, setting aside his garden tools. Detective, didn't expect to find you out this way. I make it a point to be thorough. Holloway's shrewd eyes took in the cabin, the freshly turned garden soil, the carved wooden figures drying on the porch railing, small animals clearly made for a child's hands. You've built something meaningful here. After your loss, I mean. The personal observation caught Mason off guard. You've been asking about me, about everyone connected to Mrs. Hayes, or Mrs. Miller to use her legal name. Holloway ran a hand along his horse's neck. It's interesting work, piecing together the true shape of people's lives from the fragments they leave behind, the stories they tell themselves and others. Mason remained silent, waiting for the detective to reach his point. I've concluded my investigation, Holloway said finally. I thought you might want to hear the outcome directly, rather than through town gossip. Mason's heart quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. I'm listening. Dr. James Miller died from injuries sustained in a fall down the stairs of his Chicago home 6 years ago, Holloway recited as if reading from an official report. His blood contained excessive amounts of alcohol and laudanum. His wife, Catherine Miller, reported finding him unconscious upon returning home from visiting a friend. She summoned medical help immediately, but he died without regaining consciousness. The detective paused, studying Mason's reaction before continuing. Subsequent investigation revealed a history of domestic incidents carefully concealed from public view. Dr. Miller's colleagues acknowledged his struggle with substance, though his reputation as a physician remained untarnished. Several household staff provided statements suggesting Mrs. Miller had endured significant abuse throughout the marriage. Mason's hands clenched involuntarily. And your conclusion? Officially, the case remains as originally determined, an accidental death resulting from intoxication and subsequent fall. There is insufficient evidence to justify reopening the investigation or pursuing charges. Catherine Miller. Holloway's tone remained professional, but something in his eyes suggested personal judgment withheld. She is free to continue her life here as Catherine Hayes, though I've advised her to properly register her name change with territorial authorities to prevent future complications. Relief flooded through Mason with such force that he had to turn away momentarily, pretending to check something in his garden. When he faced Holloway again, he had regained his composure. Does she know? I informed her this morning before riding out to see you. Holloway replaced his hat. She asked me to tell you she'll be at the Eastern Ridge Meadow at sunset, she and the child. The detective mounted his horse with practiced ease. Before departing, he fixed Mason with a final, assessing look. The investigation into Sarah Blackwood's death was mishandled, he said abruptly. Local authorities accepted the fire as accidental despite significant evidence of arson, and the subsequent disappearance of 3 timber company employees was never properly pursued. He paused. If I were investigating those cases now, I might reach different conclusions than my predecessor. Mason met his gaze steadily. But you're not investigating those cases? No, Holloway agreed. I'm not. My jurisdiction ends with Catherine Miller's situation. He gathered his rein. We all have our ghosts, Black. The question is whether we let them haunt us or finally lay them to rest. With a slight nod, he turned his horse and rode back toward town, leaving Mason to consider his words in the quiet of the forest clearing. As sunset approached, Mason made his way up the familiar trail to the eastern ridge. The path that had once been a solitary pilgrimage of grief now felt like a road toward possibility. Spring had begun its gentle reclamation of the damaged areas, tender green shoots pushing through disturbed soil, wildflowers opening defiantly among broken branches. Catherine and Emma waited in the meadow beside the cabin foundation. They had brought a picnic blanket and a basket, creating a small island of domesticity among the wildflowers. At Mason's approach, Emma bounded forward with her usual enthusiasm, while Catherine remained seated, watching their reunion with quiet joy. Mason! Mason! Emma called, racing toward him. The detective man is leaving tomorrow? Mother says we can stay forever now. Mason scooped her up easily, settling her against his side as he approached the blanket. Forever's a long time, little one. I know, she nodded seriously. That's why it's so good. Catherine rose to greet him, her face more relaxed than it had been in weeks. The constant worry that had shadowed her expression had lifted, revealing the natural grace that had first caught his attention. Holloway found you, she said. Mason nodded, setting Emma down gently. He did. Seemed to think I'd want to hear his conclusions firsthand. A perceptive man in many ways, Catherine observed, though I'm glad to see the back of him. They sat together on the blanket while Emma explored nearby, collecting pebbles and sticks for her ever-growing nature collection. The sunset painted the meadow in shades of gold and amber, turning the distant mountains purple against the reddening sky. I've been thinking, Catherine said after a comfortable silence, about what comes next. Mason turned to her, suddenly uncertain. With the threat of prosecution removed, Catherine was truly free for the first time in years, free to go anywhere, build any life she chose. The school board has reaffirmed my position, she continued. With Holloway's investigation concluded favorably, they're eager to put the whole matter behind them. We could stay in Timber Creek, continue as we have been. She hesitated, glancing toward the remains of the cabin foundation, or we could consider other possibilities. Mason followed her gaze, understanding dawning slowly. You mean here? Rebuilding? Catherine nodded. Emma loves this meadow, and it feels right, somehow creating something new where something precious once stood. She reached for his hand. But only if you're ready. I would never presume to replace Sarah's memory. Mason looked out over the meadow, feeling the presence of the past alongside the promise of the future. Sarah would have liked you, he said finally. Your strength, your kindness. She wouldn't have wanted this place to remain empty forever. From the edge of the clearing, Emma called out excitedly, Mother! Mason, come see what I found. They rose together, following her voice to where she stood beside a familiar boulder, the very one she'd first compared Mason to months ago. She pointed eagerly at a tiny sapling growing from a crack in the massive stone. A tree is growing right out of the rock! Her expression was triumphant, as if she'd discovered something miraculous. The seed must have fallen into the crack, and now it's growing. Mason knelt beside her, examining the determined little tree that had found life in the most unlikely place. So it is, see? Emma placed her small hand on the boulder's rough surface. I told you the crack cracks are important. That's where new things can grow. Catherine joined them, resting her hand on Mason's shoulder as he remained kneeling beside the child in the stone. The three of them formed a perfect tableau against the sun setting. Family forged not by blood, but by choice, by shared understanding of both damage and heal. Emma's right, Catherine said softly. Sometimes what seems like damage creates space for something new to take root. Mason looked up at her, then at Emma, then back to the tiny tree emerging from solid stone life, finding a way despite all odds. In that moment, he felt the last of his barriers dissolve, the grief he'd carried for 8 years finally transforming into something that could nourish rather than consume. Yes, he agreed, rising to his full height and drawing both of them into his embrace. I believe it does. 6 months later, a new cabin stood on the eastern ridge, larger than the original, and positioned to catch both sunrise and sunset through carefully placed windows. The meadow bloomed with tended wildflowers, and a small fence protected the vegetable garden from deer and rabbits. On the wide front porch, 3 rocking chairs of varying sizes faced the spectacular view, one large, one medium, one small. The town of Timber Creek had gradually adjusted to the unconventional family that now divided their time between the schoolhouse during the week and the ridge cabin on weekends and holidays. The wedding had been simple but well attended, with even former skeptics offering congratulations to the unlikely couple who had found each other against considerable odds. Mason still served as forest warden, but he no longer patrolled alone. Emma frequently accompanied him, learning the names of trees and the habits of wildlife with the same enthusiasm she brought to her mother's lessons. Catherine continued teaching, but had also begun documenting the ridge's remarkable ecosystem in detailed journals that she hoped to publish someday. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the forest in russet and gold, Mason stood at the edge of the meadow watching Catherine and Emma arrange wildflowers on the original cabin's foundation. Stones, a ritual they performed each season to honor both the past and the present. The boulder with its determined sapling had become something of a family monument. Already the young tree had grown several inches, its roots somehow finding nourishment in the seemingly barren stone. Mason often found himself pausing beside it during his daily routines, marveling at its stubborn persistence. "You're bigger than that rock," Emma had told him once, her childish observation piercing straight to the heart of his suffering. Looking at his family now, at the life they were building together on ground once scarred by tragedy, Mason knew she had been right all along. The hardened giant had fallen, not in defeat but in transformation. Through the cracks in his carefully constructed armor, light had finally entered, and with it, love had found a way to grow.